Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. We are very excited to host this panel in the context of the CSCW workshop, Decolonizing Learning Spaces for Sociotechnical Research and Design. Before we begin, I want to let everyone know that this panel will have interpretation to both Spanish and Portuguese. All you need to do is click on the interpretation button that you have on your webinar window and select the language that you would like to listen this panel into. I want to begin by acknowledging that I'm currently on the traditional territory of the Pawtucket and Massachusetts groups. My name is Pedro Reynolds Cuellar. I'm a PhD student at the Media Arts and Sciences program at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. So welcome. On behalf of the organizing team that you see here, I want to thank all participants for their valuable contributions to this workshop. And I want to also acknowledge their presence this morning with us. I want to thank our panel for accepting being part of this conversation and to CSCW for opening the space for it. With that, I want to pass it to Marisol.
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me? Is everything good with the audio? Yes?
I can hear you, yeah.
Okay, great. Hi, I'm Marisol. I'm a PhD, Marisol Juan Villacres. I'm a PhD student at Georgia Tech. And just like Pedro said, I'd like to thank everybody for their support and the organizing team and the panelists for being here, for all the hard work in putting together the program for this workshop. So the next thing that I'd like to do is to go over the motivation for this workshop. We, the organizers, come from a diverse set of experiences participating in spaces for learning, socio-technical research, and design. And because of that, we know from firsthand the importance that these spaces have in how technology is understood and disseminated globally. And also because of that same reason, we know firsthand too that oftentimes the concepts, paradigms, and practices that these learning spaces champion are not necessarily adequate for the context outside of a dominant idea of the norm. Pedro, if you can move it to the next slide. In fact, oftentimes the things that we learn in these spaces end up supporting a notion that there's only one way of understanding design, knowledge, and progress. For example, different technology interventions have imposed a notion of privacy in African villages that does not match with the cultural practices of those communities. The next slide, Pedro. Further, researchers from the Global South often struggle to make their work visible and valued in academic circles outside of their local context. And we know very well that fields like CSCW and human-computer interaction are continuously fostering activities, initiatives for including these less dominant views. However, somehow these initiatives, they keep emphasizing on an us versus them paradigm that hinders opportunities for mutual learning. This workshop, and especially today's panel, is an effort to explore how decolonial theories and practices can inform ways to change what we usually assume as the only way of doing things. Not the next slide, the same one. Decolonial thinking proposes to break away from these binaries of the North versus the South, the oppressed versus the oppressor, the culture versus nature, because those binaries are actually essential for the articulation of power that we are going through right now, that we experience on an everyday basis. Inspired by popular struggles and communities of resistance around the world, well, decolonial thinking actually argues that what we should do is foster a world of many worlds. If you can move to the next slide, sorry. Or what is called the pluriverse, where contradicting ways of knowledge can coexist and thrive in partial connections with the rest, without needing to align with each other or claiming more validity over others. So Pedro, you can take it from here.
Thank you so much, Marisol. So building on what you were saying, I think our hope for this workshop is that we are able to create a space where we can together contribute to bridging these important themes using our experiences, our traditions and visions for the future, to be able to imagine radical and practical ways in which the spaces where we learn and engage can take advantage of the different forms of knowledge production that we have to offer. So to kickstart this quest, we have the honor to host a wonderful group of thinkers and practitioners. And while I let you learn a little bit more about our panelists from this slide, I want to share how this panel is going to work. So let's begin. The panel will open with a question to all our guests. Each of them will have 5 minutes to respond. Following this round, we will ask one question to each of our panel members and give them 5 minutes to respond. We will devote the last half hour to questions from the audience. So you can begin to send your questions using the Q&A function on your webinar window, which you can find at the bottom. Feel free to ask questions in English, Spanish, or Portuguese. And again, just a reminder for those who are just arriving, this panel has interpretation in both Spanish and Portuguese. All you have to do is click on the interpretation function on your webinar window and select the language that you want to listen into. Marisol?
Thank you, Pedro. So we're going to start with the introductory question that is for all panelists. Each panelist is going to take 5 minutes to answer, and so we'll let you know once you've already talked for 4 minutes and when the 5-minute mark is approaching. We'd like to start with our panelist Guido Caicedo. Guido is faculty at the Escuela Superior Politécnica del Litoral, or ESPOL, in Ecuador, where he has over 20 years of experience teaching human-computer interaction to computer science students. He's also executive director of ESPOL's Entrepreneurship and Innovation Center. His professional experience includes leading teams in tech companies that develop internet platform services in Ecuador, co-founding 2 internet security companies, and being product manager of a company that commercialized the first internet secure credit card platform and the first e-magazine distribution platform in Latin America. Guido, hello. Thank you for joining us. The first question, which is for everybody, is how would you define decolonization based on your personal experiences?
Okay, thank you, Marisol, for inviting me to this panel. I'm kind of, I have to be honest with everyone, I'm kind of the alien here in the sense that the decolonizing concept was kind of a little bit new for me. And as a matter of fact, the word, I'm still struggling to understand completely the concept. And I'm not sure if that word, I'm still not comfortable with the word. But I love a lot the concept of what Marisol was talking about. And I would say that during my work in ESPOL, the university in which I work, and especially in the Entrepreneurship Center, we work to have people that is independent, but at the same time connected with other humans and that create value to the society. That's the main reason that moves us in the Entrepreneurship and Innovation Center. And this is important because you find people or entrepreneurs that want to build the next Facebook. So one of the questions I asked to them is, why do you want to do that? I mean, what is the problem you're solving? So I think we need to work a lot in our universities on having our students understanding better what are they studying for. I mean, what are the problems they want to solve? And they need to connect better with the problems that they are having in their local context. So I believe what we should do in universities, especially in the learning part, is having our students to have more contact with their environment, with their society. So we at ESPOL, we have been having for 2 years a design thinking course that is being taught to every freshman in the university. So in that course, they work together with NGOs and social organizations, even companies, trying to solve real problems. And of course, they are too young to build a product or a service or a finished solution, but they get to work to prototypes or to help their clients to understand better the problem. So I think one of the important things that we have to do in the global South is to have our students to get more in touch with our own societies and our own problems, instead of just getting everything that comes from the standardized knowledge that we learn in universities. Also, it's important for us because of the multidisciplinarity, because those teams are, from different degrees. So if if you study design or you study computer science, you will work with somebody who's studying economy or other degrees. So, and that's great because that helps you to develop these just different points of view about the world and about the solutions. And also, I think it's important to have tools, to give them tools that help them, that work better with the local context in which they live. As for example, in our entrepreneurship and innovation course, we used to use a tool which is called the Javelin board, which is a tool for user research and analysis. And we thought that tool didn't fit well with the local culture and the way we interact with users and clients. So we developed another one, which we call the cake map. And we've been using it for a couple of years, and it's working very well. And I think that's also an important thing. And the last thing I want to talk about is, I don't know if I'm okay with the time, but is in my Entrepreneurship and Innovation Center, we also deal with tech transfer and innovation. And so we work a lot with researchers in the university. And one of the things that we think is very, very important is that research has to be based also on local demand, or at least more based on local demand. We call that demand-based research. So much of the research that's been done in the university is guided by what students, PhD, what they learn when they study in other universities. So when they come back, it's hard for them to sync with other local problems and research on them. So we are trying to push in the university for having more of that kind of research, because the results of that kind of research would be more useful and also will be more not only useful for solutions in our local society, but also more useful for our students, because they will have more knowledge that has a better connection with what is happening here. So I don't know if I'm okay within the time, but okay, I read a message. It's time. Okay, so I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Guido. And yes, somehow the sound is not working just for the panelists. We'll find a way. Pedro, you take it from here, I guess.
Yeah, thank you so much, Guido. So to continue in conversation, we have now Anasuya Sengupta. Anasuya is co-director of Whose Knowledge, a global campaign focused on centering the knowledge of marginalized communities on the internet. She has led initiatives in India and the US and across the global South, internationally for over 20 years to amplify marginalized voices in virtual and physical worlds. So Anasuya, it's a pleasure to have you with us today. And I would like to ask you the same question. How would you define decolonization based on your professional or personal experience?
Thank you so much, Pedro, and thank you, Guido, because I hope to be in conversation with you as I respond. Let me start with the personal. So I'm Anasuya. I was born and brought up in India. I moved to the United States in 2007 in my mid-30s, which is a interesting time to move with 2 suitcases, as many of us have experience in doing. And then I moved again last year to London, to the United Kingdom. So in many ways, I am a really embodied experience of global south to global north diaspora and back again. And particularly right now, as I sit in the land of my colonizers. Um, I am also Savarna, which in the Indian system of caste means that I'm upper caste because it is a terrible, um, oppressive social structure that is based on constructed notions of pollution and purity. And I will come back to what that means for me and for the way I think about decolonization. And I also have a foot in academia as I do the work that I do with Whose Knowledge. And I love that in the introductory slide, you have Whose Knowledge as who is knowledge, which is, I think, a really important question, as well as, you know, the way that we title ourselves, which is whose knowledge, that is, whose knowledge is it? And both of those, I think, are critical questions around decolonization. Um, the way that I think about decolonization myself and for Whose Knowledge, which is a um, global multilingual campaign to center the knowledges of marginalized communities across the world. And for us, marginalization is marginalization by structures of power and privilege. So women, people of color, indigenous folks, queer folks, others from the global south, people of disabilities, we are all marginalized in different ways. We are not minorities. We are the majority of the world. And so as I think about decolonization for myself and for the work we do, I'm going to offer a definition that we have come up with. For us, it's the personal and systemic unpacking and dismantling of historical structures of power and privilege. These structures govern the ways that we think, and that's really important. What we think, that's really important. Who we are, what we do, how we do it. Historically, though, the way that I think about colonization, and then we'll come to decolonization, is that I, as someone from India, am from one of from actually the first country in Asia and Africa um, to have independence, to fight for independence from our colonial masters, the British. Latin American independence movements are, of course, earlier than the 20th century. We forget that colonization is such a recent um, experience for many of us across Asia and Africa, and that there are versions of colonization that continue within our own countries, because the way that we construct nations, of course, is also something to be debated and deconstructed and rethought of. So colonization has, for us, three major elements. First, the control and domination of territories. And we can define territories in different ways, but as we know, colonization from the point of view of nations, they have been about land. It has been about the extraction of resources, whether they're tangible or intangible, money, minerals, knowledge, and the exploitation and dehumanization of people. And that, I think, is a really important aspect. So as people in scholarship, it's really important for us to remember that what we understand as academia, Western academia right now, comes out of, especially in science and technology, the ways we understand science and tech come out of 18th century Enlightenment. But the 18th century was also the age of empire for all of us across Asia, Latin America, and Africa. And so even the notions, for instance, of race was constructed by researchers. Race was constructed by anthropologists and other researchers from colonial institutions in, for instance, the UK, in the United Kingdom, as a rationalization for colonization, as a rationalization for the exploitation of people, territories, and resources. So we need to recognize this, even as we recognize it within our own nations. So just as Marisol said, decolonization is not about simple binaries. So we can construct a very obvious understanding of decolonization between the global north and the global south. But what about within the global south itself, within our own nations, our own communities? What does it mean, for instance, for me to be a Savarna or upper caste woman whose ancestors have for millennia oppressed the Dalit, who are pejoratively, who were formerly pejoratively known as the untouchable, right? What does it mean for race in Latin America? One of my compañeras at Whose Knowledge, who is one of the co-founders of the collective, is Afro-Indigenous Brazilian. And Brazil has the largest diaspora of erstwhile slaves, right? The largest Black diaspora in the world is not in the United States, it is in Brazil. What does it mean for us to think about what race and indigeneity and mean within our own countries? What does it mean for me as an oppressor to think about caste? So all of these come together in the way we think about knowledge, who we think about, what we think about, and how we think about them. And I can come back to that in the next round. But for me, in particular, we think about decolonization very much in terms of knowledge justice, of epistemic justice, of the plurality of knowledges, of epistemic systems that all of us hold in multiple ways that have not been understood alongside each other. The pluriverse as, once again, of knowledge. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ana Suya. That was really interesting and enlightening. Now we're going to go to Paola Ricaurte and ask her the same question. Paola is an associate professor in the Department of Media and Digital Culture at Tecnológico de Monterrey, Mexico City, and a digital rights activist. She conducts research on decoloniality, feminism, and technology, and she'll continue building networks among activists, journalists, and academics working on artificial intelligence in the global south. I think I'll repeat the question. How would you define decoloniality or decolonization from your experiences professionally, personally?
First of all, thank you very much for organizing this amazing panel. I'm super happy to be here and have the opportunity to talk with you. And I'm going to apologize to Ana Suya and others because I'm going to speak in Spanish. I'm still having trouble to speak and thinking in English, so
I'm sorry. We didn't let you know before, but I mean we have the service, but we just
okay.
Yes, so that people won't be having to change and switch. That's why we prefer right now that everybody speaks English.
Okay, I'll try to do my best. Well, I'm happy to be to come after Ana Suya's comments because she explained like I share with her a lot of the basic assumptions about the coloniality. And if you ask me in my personal experience, how do I understand the coloniality? I would say that it's a process in various layers or levels, and it implies to acknowledge, to make visible and try to reverse all the mechanisms that Western civilization and the Western model of the world excludes others, and as Ana Suya said, other ways of thinking, being, and being and feeling, that are never acknowledged and are always excluded. I think that this Occidental or Western model of the world uses not only systems of knowledge production, but also social technical systems to impose this unique model of the world. So in this way, this difference, this ontological difference, that's the way we understand the difference of being, implies that everybody who is different by any cause, like racial difference, gender difference, is going to be considered inferior. And their knowledge is not going to be as valuable as the knowledge that is produced in the Western world. So our thoughts, our worldviews, our ways of feeling will not have the same value, and that has a lot of implications for us that are not considered, or that we are not assumed that we are Western, because it depends. It has implications in the sense that we have to define how do we produce knowledge, how do we share knowledge, for whom do we produce knowledge, and with whom to produce knowledge, and for what. So in my point of view, the first thing is that we have to acknowledge the position and the place that we occupy in these systems of knowledge production, and the place, in this case, universities, the role the universities play in this model of knowledge domination, and try to revert that in everything we do, not only the methodologies, but also our political practices and ways of understanding the relationship between people and with the environment, for example. I will finish there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Paola. And thank you for making the effort to speak in English. We're trying to, make it a little easier for both the interpreters and people who are listening on YouTube who don't have the access to interpretation. So we really appreciate you making the effort there. Now I have the pleasure to introduce Asnath Kambunga. Asnath is a Marie Curie PhD Fellow at the Department of Digital Design and Information Studies at Aarhus University. Her research interest lies in working with youth, communities, and collaborative explorations of futures. In her PhD project, she is exploring how everyday post-colonial memories of Namibian youth could be co-created, experimented, as well as contribute to the decolonization discourse. So Asnath, thank you so much for being here. And I'm going to repeat the question for you. How would you define decolonization based on your professional and personal experiences?
Hello, thank you. Can you all hear me?
Yeah,
okay.
All good.
Thank you. Yeah. So yeah, I feel very privileged to be part of this panel and to be able to share my knowledge and learn from others. So I definitely agree with what the other panelists have actually, how they have explained decolonization, and it's somehow in line with how I understand it as well. So to me, decolonization means shifting our gaze from the norm and looking into other ways of knowing, like towards, at least towards the coexistence of in this world. And it also means challenging or disrupting the hegemonic approaches to doing and to knowing. at least to create a world where everybody feels part of. So yeah, in my work, so my work is centered around everyday experiences of colonialism, specifically looking into how Namibian youth engage in discussions that relates to anything that has to do with colonialism in their everyday life. So how they create consciousness among themselves, what they are actually doing in their everyday life to contribute to the decolonization agenda. And and I'm mostly interested in the methodological approaches, especially because my project is already touching based on colonialism. And then I don't want to use methods that are actually colonizing people in that sense. And and then ultimately creating spaces where people can freely discuss issues relating to colonialism in their everyday life. So I actually like what Anastasia said, that colonialism, it's like happens, or it's presented at like a wide spectrum. And we need to think of what is actually happening in our own communities right now, instead of just thinking what happened like 100 years ago or 30 years ago, like in the Namibian context. But then what is happening right now in Namibia, where you still have people being pushed to the margins just because they don't have experiences of colonialism to say. So the way I understand now decolonization or decoloniality, it's through agency of people, like what are they doing? How are they engaged in these discussions? And then that's also what interests me. And because I think it's through agency and consciousness of communities, different people actually start to have deeper discussions shifting towards the coloniality. And it's through these experiences where decolonization manifests. And as in my research, I'm also mostly interested into how can people participating in research projects or in any technological based, like where we are creating systems, how can like at least motivating people or people being aware of their rights somehow, of knowing that knowledge actually matters from the start, instead of just being participants, knowing that they are not just informants if it's ethnographic research and which contribute to development, but knowing that their ambitions or their values will be translated into these tangible outputs. Yeah, so I think I'll end here, and then, yeah, thanks.
Thank you so much, Asnat. Just wanted to remind all the panelists that the way we are letting you know that time is close is via the chat. Okay, and so now to end this part of the panel, we have Ahmed Ansari. He's an assistant professor in integrated digital media at New York University. He is a founding member of the Decolonizing Design platform, and his research intersects at the confluence of critical cultural studies, design studies, and history, and the philosophy and history of technology with a focus on South Asian contexts. His recent work looks at decolonizing knowledge production in design history, ethnography and theory, and on the applications of non-Anglo-European knowledge systems to developing new ways of thinking and practicing design. Thank you for being here, Ahmed. And again, I'll leave you with a question. How would you define decolonizing from your professional and personal experience?
Thank you, Marisol, and thank you all for having me here. Can you all hear me? Yes? Okay. So, I'd like to start with the personal and give an account of how I became interested in the kinds of concerns and questions that I am. Quite a few years ago, in fact, almost a decade now, I had been kind of like always questioning the education that I'd received, the design education that I'd received as an undergrad. And later on, when I began to teach for the first time, one of my principal concerns, and these were concerns that were shared with other faculty in Pakistan, in Karachi, where I was teaching, was how, we were all kind of aware that the knowledge that we were imparting did not entirely serve the context within which we were living, and sort of practicing our art or our field. And this became extremely, explicit. I became painfully aware of this kind of lack, in particular around about 2011, when I was teaching a class on service design, and we were working our sort of client or our partner for that project. It was a semester-long project. Was Karachi's largest public hospital, the civil hospital. And after the class ended, we were working on signage systems and wayfinding systems and trying to understand the hospital. This is a hospital that caters to the vast majority of people who come there are the urban and rural working class. In fact, you have quite a large sort of chunk of the patient population that comes there actually belongs to sort of like places outside of the city proper. So interior Sindh, the province of Sindh, where Karachi is located. And I was working with my students there, what we began to realize was that the part of the reason that the signage systems weren't working, was because, apart from the fact that like no one, majority of people coming to the hospital for treatment didn't speak Urdu or let alone English, Urdu being the national language. They all kind of spoke and understood regional dialects, variations on Sindhi. But what we also found that, got me to thinking about how poorly sort of like formulated my own education was that they had an entirely different way of making sense of the visual and the material. And that kind of gave me an insight into, there are already worlds out there. I'm very privileged. I'm privileged enough to be middle class, educated in English, in Pakistan, urban, but it sort of hit home that what we were talking about and what I was kind of seeing was not just differences in class or ethnicity or language, but that these differences went deeper. They went to what we call they were ontological differences. They were fundamental in a way. And so this got me interested in kind of thinking about different ontologies, and ontologies of the human, and the ways in which people make sense of and are in sort of like the world in completely different ways. And so I guess if I had to give, and so therefore that kind of led to my interest in other sort of like genealogies and other ontologies of thought, other ways of knowing, other ways of seeing, other ways of interpreting, and other ways of being in the world. If I had to give a definition, I would probably say that, decolonization for me means kind of reifying or supporting the plurality of worlds, and in fact, creating the possibilities for new worlds to emerge that privilege those and that empower those who have been historically, systemically at the mercy of oppressive regimes of power, and that this entails a kind of delinking of habits of thought, habits of feeling, habits of practice, delinking, from habits and dependencies, that we've kind of been conditioned into. And this entails not only a conditioning and a delinking from Anglo-European habits of thought and feeling and practice, but also local forms of oppression, local ontologies that are oppressive. Anasuya had meant, I share with Anasuya and all the others on this panel this kind of anxiety around decolonization right now. I think that, there's been a too quick an uptake of it and too uncritical an uptake of the term. So I have certain anxieties there, but we can talk about those over the rest of the panel.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ahmed. Okay, so just wanted to remind, now we're gonna go into the second, yes, that's a nice light up, into the second round of questions. And so we wanted to remind you that if you have any questions right now, it'd be good to start like writing them down, entering those in the Q&A section, and we can answer those after the second round. Also another, again, like reminder that we're gonna let panelists know that it's been 4 minutes via the chat. Okay, so I think we can move to the individual questions. And so we're going to start with Ahmed again. This time the question, well, it's not going to be on the screen, but it's, how would you define decolonizing in the context of design education? Now that you've explained your experience, right, of how you faced this weird situation where you realized there was something ontological going on. How can we face that in learning spaces, classrooms, learning spaces, and professional learning spaces, etc.?
So I think there's two aspects to it, and I'm going to kind of term them, although they're very tightly linked. One is kind of like, I think that academic institutions need a kind of structural and programmatic transformation, and the other thing is the kind of the other thing that they need is that design schools and design programs need a kind of epistemological and practical shift and transformation that way. And I'll talk about what I mean for both of these. When it comes to design research and the way that design is taught, and both in the South and in the North, right? I had spoken about delinking, and I think what design schools need to do, first of all, if we talk about privileging knowledges otherwise, right, and we talk about privileging all kinds of knowledges that come from all kinds of places, right? I think that there's something that needs to happen even before we can talk about decolonizing, which is that design programs actually need to value knowledges from other disciplines within the sort of academy, and move away from like this very narrow focus on the things that they consider to be historically as designerly, and then we can talk about sort of privileging knowledges apart from, I think there's a deeper issue here, which is a kind of anti-intellectualism in design education. It's kind of weird to be talking about anti-intellectualism in the context of the academy, which is where you would least expect to find it, but that's unfortunately something that happens, right? And this is particularly kind of exacerbated for all kinds of historical reasons, which include the ways in which institutions of design that teach art, design, architecture was set up in the global South, right? So, in other words, like academic institutions in the global South have inherited these ways of sort of privileging certain things, certain very narrow forms of practice and forsaking or outright kind of ignoring other forms of practice and not engaging with other disciplines at all. And that also includes not engaging with local knowledge systems. And I do think that this move towards like privileging, other forms of discipline, other forms of practice, other forms of knowledges, as well as knowledges otherwise, needs to happen at the same time, right? So so one of the things that we find, particularly I find is true in academic institutions in the global South, is also simultaneously this kind of privileging of, or this actually, if I'll put it the other way, the denigration of local knowledge systems, with the sense that, Bauhaus modernism is somehow superior, and it leads to, that is clear communication and clear design, and that is our conception of the beautiful, and so on and so forth, right? So there needs to be a kind of epistemological sort of shift. And that can happen through a number of ways. I think that the ways in which we produce knowledge in design has to change. Design ethnography, design research has to become more reflexive, more critically self-reflexive. It has to privilege difference as ontological and deep instead of just as shallow. It has to stop creating these hierarchies of knowledge, of the privileging of certain knowledges over others. It has to be humble. So there has to be a kind of epistemic humility in the kind of knowledge that we produce, whether through research or through practice, or or through the production of design histories, or sort of theories of practice around design. So the other thing, and I'll very briefly talk about it, is I'd mentioned the kind of structural and programmatic shifts. What I mean by those is that, we need to think on how the modern academy itself is structurally oppressive. It's also, I find it I'm very wary of diversity and inclusivity initiatives, as the sole kind of mode for universities and academies to say, well, we're doing something about this, right? By diversifying the faculty, by holding kind of workshops where we talk about identity and intersectionality. I don't think that this is enough. In fact, in some ways, the exclusive reliance on these strategies within the university actually then renders the whole conversation that needs to be had about how universities in themselves are systemically set up to disenfranchise their own students and their own faculty, including the most precarious, and their own staff, many of whom are precarious, right? Adjuncts, low-paid staff workers, and so on and so forth. I think there needs to be a systemic overhaul of the university in favor of more equity and justice, for all who are part of the regime of creating knowledge. And this also means kind of like knowledge doesn't just come out of faculty. Knowledge is co-produced. It comes out of all of the different components and parts of a university. And we need to start privileging all of those. That means other things as well. I only have, I think, a few seconds left. But even within the hierarchies within universities need to be challenged as well. The ways in which certain disciplines are privileged and others are not, and sort of so there's like research tends to have particular outcomes because money flows to where, and resources flow to where universities deem there to be some kind of instrumental benefit, right? That has to also stop. We need to value knowledge we need to value different knowledges and for the different kinds of value that they produce and provide, not just in the service of reifying and sort of producing more capital. So I think that all of these are things that need to happen, even before we can talk about decolonization, and at the same time as when we talk about decolonization. I'll just stop there.
Thank you so much, Ahmed. And I appreciate the comments that you made about the impact of systems and structures like academia and the work that we do. And I want to connect that with Asnath. She is a PhD student, and we talked a little bit about her work in the context of her degree on cultural heritage and work with youth. So I'm curious as to how these structures have challenged you in doing your work, like as a PhD student and a knowledge producer. What challenges have you encountered, Asnath?
Thank you for that question. Yeah, of course, there has been challenges, or there are different challenges in relation now to knowledge creation outside academia and working with the youth in Namibia. And so, for example, one of the main challenge it's the assumption already in the community, in the Namibian community, that if you are too young to actually engage in certain discussions or to actually make decisions that will affect your future, and thus somebody actually should decide for you, And I think in this case, it's a local power structures and systems in place that are demoting and pushing these voices to the margins. So, and then only appreciating the voices for those that are better off in society, or for those that are actually very vocal, for example. But then these young people somehow they do have voices, but then their voices are not really amplified to the extent that they can contribute to whatever that affect them. And I think the other main challenge now is having people to believe this inferiority, believing that, okay, I'm actually not that important. My knowledge is not important in society. Why should I contribute anyway? So it's a change of mindset that I think it's required, and for people to know, or for people to feel empowered, because I think when it comes to decolonization, it's also a movement of empowering people or creating awareness and consciousness among communities. Because in this case, for somebody to know that who has been oppressed for too long, they tend to believe that these assumptions are actually true, and they take that in, and they just go by every day. So yeah, so I think that was another challenge that has come often, working with different youth communities in Namibia. And I think like one of the third challenge, I think I have from my side in working, and because I mean, I'm being educated in the Western knowledge system and doing research in my country. And of course, when I go to Namibia to do research, or even doing now in this pandemic, doing everything online. So I'm using the methods that I've actually learned here, and finding the balance, or most of the time finding it very difficult to contextualize it, to use the methods that I know and the cultural practices, and actually acknowledging that the knowledge of the local people that I'm working with. So it is most of the time a battle that, okay, which methods are necessary, or which methods can be used engaging people in the development of new applications, or just even in a simple PD workshop. So yeah, so most of these challenges are actually deeply rooted, and they require, I think, of course, a simple one researcher would address these issues, and I think it requires a group of people that are interested, or that are willing to address the issues. And I think also the people that we work with, for them to know that what is happening, or the form of oppression they are getting from like the local government, or in their community from, so it requires a lot of people that are willing to create change, and at least to open to somehow, I don't know, I have a problem to say that you are decolonizing people, because you cannot really do that. It's up to the people if they want to do it themselves. But yeah, these are some of the challenges that I think I'm faced with, and in most cases, to a certain degree, I know how to address those. But I think it also requires knowing the cultural, the everyday, and the cultural practices of people for you to address some of these challenges. Yeah, I'll end here for now.
Thank you so much, Asna. That's your perspective very situated outside, like within and outside of Western ways of knowing. It's very, very appreciated. So now we're going to Paola, and especially from your background, Paola, working on feminism and technologies and understanding these like different ways of knowledge. How would you describe the intersection between digital technologies, data, and colonial dynamics. So far, we've been talking about what should happen in the classroom, methods, etc. But like in terms of technology, how it should be designed, or we should be teaching about it. Thank you.
Well, yeah, it's not easy. I would say that, for example, now we're experiencing what coloniality means and how it is currently expressed through data extractivism and technology design. A dominant technology like Zoom imposes its codes and functionalities to us. What can we do and how, under what values, and at the same time is using our data to create more value for them. So this is an example of how we live this digital coloniality every day, every moment. And for me, it implies like the possibility of imagining, creating, exercising our autonomy through the design and development of alternative sociotechnical systems that dignify our existence, our ways of doing, thinking, and feeling. And these technologies, or in this case, these functionalities and codes that exclude our autonomy are not, I mean, they are designed to do that. It is not a coincidental fact. So through dominant technologies and knowledge production systems, we are reminded in every action, at every moment, that we have no right to exist the way we are. And if not through Western codes, technologies, and knowledge production systems. So in this scale, racialized women are at the bottom. Our knowledges, our voices, our ways of understanding relations, our ways of understanding the world are not considered. So my basic approach, like to, if we want to think about how to change or reverse these systems, is to, as I said, it has different like levels. You can begin at the personal level, but there are also institutions. There's the institutional level and also the systemic level. So you have to think at every level, how do you are contributing to reproduce that domination through knowledge systems and through technologies. And if you don't act like with a lot of effort and determination to reverse those systems, even if you don't acknowledge that, you can be contributing to reinforcing those systems. So basically what I would try to say is that this coloniality of power is, well, has a material dimension, but also a symbolic dimension. So we have to act in those different levels. It's not only the narratives that are constructed to reproduce this domination, but also the material systems that support them, that are the base of these domination systems. I would leave it there.
Wow, Paola, thank you so very much. I really appreciate this you know, the way that you laid out the material and the symbolic dimensions of this work. And I know that you and Anasuya share an interest for how some of these things are embodied in the internet. So Anasuya, I would like to use this opportunity to come to you with the question of how do you see colonial dynamics of domination and oppression impacting internet access and use?
Thank you, Pedro, and thank you, Paula. You laid that out so beautifully. And from what you said, what Asnat said, and Ahmed as well, I think one of the things I just want to point out is that colonization, but also capitalism, which is the system that comes out of colonization, essentially gives us what is to be valued and what is to be prioritized and who values and who prioritizes, right? So that is the overarching meta system of power and privilege that, as Paulus put so beautifully, underlies the symbolic and material systems of oppression that we look at. And that is true of the internet, right? That is true of the internet. The internet not just sort of reflects in some ways the inequities of our everyday life, and our everyday life is now on a continuum of offline to online. There is no binary there, but it in some ways exacerbates it because there's a kind of mythos around the internet as being this democratic participatory global infrastructure. And yet, when you break it down into experience and content and governance and architecture and design, you sort of start unseeing, if you like, and recognizing the levels of privilege. So I'm just going to start by offering a few just plain statistics because they've started to feel very normal to me, and they may be familiar to many of those who are listening, but there are always those who have not come across them, and I think it's useful to lay the context and then think about this a little more closely. So for us at Whose Knowledge, we think particularly in terms of the injustices of knowledge infrastructures and knowledge content and production. As Asnat said, who is producing, not just consuming, right, is a really important question. So if we look at this global internet, and I'm putting global in scare quotes, at this moment in time, over 58% of the world's population accesses the internet. Not in the same ways, of course, not all of us through PCs and laptops, most of us through the smartphone. 75% of those who are online are from the global south. 75%, right? From Asia and the Pacific Islands, from Africa, from Latin America and the Caribbean. 45%, and I would say probably over 45% now, over 45% of all women, nearly half of all women are online. Does the internet look like us? Does the design and architecture of what we experience and how we experience the internet, because we experience them as multiple internets, there are no singular internets, there's no singular internet, we experience it in different ways. Does that look like us? Does that look like any of us on this panel, right? If you look at content on the internet, so you get online, so access itself is problematic and seen as unidirectional, but okay, you get on the internet, what do you see on the internet? Of the 7,000 languages of the world, only about 480 languages have ever been published. So they are in text form. Our frenemies at Google did this estimate a few years ago that 130 million books exist that are published in about 480 languages. Most of them are European in origin. The internet is similar. So the internet's languages in many ways, in content at the very least, though in terms of sort of keyboards and other forms of hardware, that is expanding. But in terms of content, it is just about in about 500 languages that you can get some content. If you look at scholarship, digital scholarship, so all, academic scholarship online, and this is the publishing world in general, but digital scholarship, 80 to 90% of all science and social science journals that are published on JSTOR or Scopus, indexed on JSTOR or Scopus, are in English, right? As Paula pointed out, look at Zoom. Look at the fact that we are having a conversation on colonization and decolonization of sociotechnical spaces in English because we're unable to use the interpretation button for everyone. I use Ubuntu, free and open source software, and Linux. Zoom does not have the interpretation button for Linux. So Paula is being kind to me by speaking in English for me rather than speaking in Spanish, which she would be much more comfortable in. So if you look at all of this, the fact that so much of our knowledge is actually oral and embodied, many forms of knowledge are oral and embodied, and the internet reflects none of it, is deeply important to understand. I'm Wikipedian, right? I edit Wikipedia. When I edit Wikipedia, it's extraordinary to me, not just that the people, the places, the things, the events, the artifacts that I love are rarely on Wikipedia. They're rarely talked about on Wikipedia because, again, Wikipedia works as an 18th century Enlightenment encyclopedia, even though it claims to be crowdsourced and peer produced, right? So it claims a democracy or democratic participatory way of working, but at the end of it, 1 in 10 of Wikipedia editors are women, are projected to be women, right? 20% of the world, primarily Europe and North America, edits about 80% of the world. So even moving out from the sort of proprietary platforms of the internet, we're looking at a place like Wikipedia that is still, that still symbolizes and still in material form of text and of knowledge embodies colonial practices of oppression and valuation. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Anasuya. And also thank you so much for explaining clearly why it was so hard to, for instance, make this a multilingual event, which it should be, because there are implications in the way Zoom is designed. And so thinking about that and technology creation, coming from a computer science background myself, and also going back to Guido, who is a computer science educator, who is working in entrepreneurship in terms of technology. And after hearing all these thoughts in terms of how there are already implications of dominant ways of looking at the world in the way we teach design, computer science, technology creation, et cetera. Guido, what would you think it's in terms of facilitating students in transitioning to entrepreneurs, creators of technology? What pathways do you see for regions like Latin America, which is it's a huge region, and I know you can only speak from an Ecuadorian perspective, but you also have knowledge of what's going on around. What are the pathways that you see for regions like Latin America to counteract in the classroom colonial dynamics in the production of digital technologies?
Well, I think in the last question or in the first question, I jumped too quickly on answering that, because I was talking about the importance for us in Latin America to have our students, getting more connected to the problems we have and to the people that is having their problems. So I gave a few examples of what we're doing at our university. And I quite much agree with what Ahmed was saying about how universities can be such a structure that is very close even within universities we are supposed to be temples of freedom and the whole thing, but we are very not working that much with each other, and that's important. But also having our people, our professors, our students getting connected with the work. In entrepreneurship, basically the good concept of entrepreneurship is that you can change the world, you can transform the world. But in order to do that, you have to get to know the problem. So there's one other thing that is important in universities, and Ahmed also talked a little bit of that, of not only it's about students or faculty, it's everyone. We are having these innovation processes in the university in which we try to solve problems of the university, but we have sort of a contest in which everyone can participate. So we have faculty together with employees and students working together trying to solve problems. And I think Asna was talking about the problem of confidence that as a researcher or as a student you might have. And I believe entrepreneurship is a great way to fight that, because if in the learning process you design it in such a way so students can have small successes, the confidence grows, and then they can achieve a higher things. Now, I wanna thank everyone in the panel, because I'm learning a lot about the decolonization concept, and I agree basically with everything that you said. But I want to go back to what I said before. The only thing that I am struggling to agree with is the term, because I don't know, when you use decolonizing, there are two parts in the word. One is colonizing, and the other one is which is removing. And since I come from I do a lot of work on entrepreneurship. In entrepreneurship, we see more change as a transformation, not removing things. So, because in colonialism, it's hard to say how far back that goes. I mean, we talk about the global north and the global south, but the truth is that in Guayaquil, which is the city in which I live, we had an indigenous culture here, which is called the Huancavilcas, and they were conquered by the Incas, and the Incas colonized us. And I think colonizing has been part of the conquering mechanism of the world for a long time. And I don't know if it's going to stop, but also I think it's not the only way in which one culture can impose or not impose, but can like overload the ways of doing of others. And in technology now, we are seeing things like that. If you take, for example, Facebook, I mean, I don't think, they are more like into manipulation kind of thing, and if you get into Facebook, you get by your own will, but you're being manipulated. Your data is being, analyzed, and they are trying to, without you knowing, trying to convince you or making you do, and I think that's also a way in which, there can be oppression, and there can be other things that you were talking about. So, in that sense, also, I think colonization is I don't know if this is the right word. And also, I mean, when you were talking, I mean, yeah, everyone has a little bit of a different understanding of colonization, and we also have a responsibility to the other people that is not doing research on this, and how everyone would take that word. And I'm a little bit afraid that it could be a little bit polarizing in the sense. I mean, there are so many things about the global north that I don't want to dismantle, and there are so many things that I want to dismantle. So, I mean, I'm having a little bit of conflict with the word, and I just wanted to use that last few seconds to talk about that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Guido. We really appreciate your perspective on this. So we want to be cognizant of the time. We're running a little bit behind the schedule. So what we want to do is bring in now the questions that were asked in the Q&A, and we'll spend the next 15 minutes wrestling with those questions. So I'm going to read the question out loud along with the name of the person who asked the question, and I'll ask our panelists to feel free to chip in and respond as you see fit. The first question comes from Aura Raban, and I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly. Thank you, everyone. How can we practically revert those practice of knowledge domination as researchers?
Feel free. Whoever wants to answer that one, feel free. Please to go ahead.
Marisol, I can't see the hand raise sign emoticon, but I'll just raise my hand in the video.
Yeah, feel free to jump in.
You either.
I guess I can speak to knowledge production and sort of in relation to delinking. So I think there's a couple of things, right? Like as design researchers, whether we're doing ethnography in the field or whether we're doing historical archival work, or sort of like tracing theoretical genealogies. There's a couple of things, I'd mentioned them before, and I can talk about them a little bit more. I think three things that I would give as takeaways are, I think we need to engender a basic stance of epistemic humility, which is basically acknowledging that no knowledge there's no hierarchy of knowledges, right? That we need to be, that the ways in which we've been conditioned to produce knowledge disciplinarily does not mean that there is value in other ways of producing knowledge about the world, right? And that there is no true or authentic or accurate sort of like description of reality, right? There is no one narrative that kind of speaks to it all. So I think engendering a stance of epistemic humility is necessary. I think the second thing that needs to be done is taking a critical reflexivity, which is that what we know about the world is not only cannot be exhaustive, but also that the purpose of knowledge production in design should be as much to bring an attention to the very conditions that produce knowledge, right? And to sort of bring the eye inward back on the self, right? To cause us to reflect on if I'm observing this thing in the world and I'm kind of translating it in this way, then thinking about what is my relation to the subject of my research, what kind of interlocutor am I, what kind of translator am I when I take what I've learned and I translated it for audiences, whether in the academy or in other parts of the world or wherever have you, right? So I think that a critical reflexivity is necessary, right? What knowledge you produce should also cause you to reflect back on your own position as researcher, as well as the systems of knowledge within which you are working as a researcher. And then the third thing I think is, and I'll just very quickly just finish so that, Anasuya and the others can go, is I think one thing that we can do is kind of trying to trace genealogies of other knowledges, right? And this is, something that I do in my own work, which is I'm an anti-historicist in this way. It may sound a little weird, but I also am very like kind of critical of the words like pre-colonial, colonial, post-colonial, or the traditional and the modern, because they kind of tend to imply that they're stages in history, right? Whereas really all societies have been modern and all societies are historical change is continuous, and always sort of like the past kind of bleeds into the present and bleeds into the future. There's no clean and clear distinctions. That itself is a kind of colonial move, is historicizing. And so we can find in a way those other knowledges today around us. And I think that, and also doing the work of kind of informing ourselves through other sort of genealogies of knowledge is a kind of third move, right? And that means kind of questioning the very concepts with which we make sense of things in the world. We should be thinking about what local frames of reference we can use when we make sense of things in the world, rather than European concepts that we've inherited. So I'll just stop there.
Thank you so much, Ahmed. And I know Anasuya and Paola would like to follow. So Anasuya, please feel free to go. And Paola, you can just jump after Anasuya's done.
I'll try and be quick because I want to hear what Paola has to say. I just want to start actually by going back to what Guido said, because I think as researchers, whether in the academia or outside, as scholars and practitioners, and I come not as an academic, but I suppose as a scholar practitioner, it's important what words we use, because words matter. And I think the reason we use decolonization, even as words are imperfect, is because just as the word feminist or feminism, there's an immediate sense of discomfort. And discomfort is important, because discomfort is important to change structures of power, right? And as researchers, I think exactly as Ahmed said, our critical self-reflexivity has to look at our own experiences of discomfort and what that implies in the larger spaces that we're in as academics and as researchers. So positionalities of power and our own self-reflexivity is deeply important. But then there's also what Guido said, and I agree with too. And so these are not binaries, they're polarities, which is the reimagination, right? That imagination is at the core of the way in which things have got, whose imaginations do we value, right? And how do we value them? How do we think of the worlds? And so as researchers, and particularly I think for those who are listening to this panel, I imagine that many of you, I may be wrong, but many of you are diasporic, you speak multiple languages, you come from many parts of the world, particularly from the global South. You embody multiple systems of knowledge, right? How do you express that? How do you find the courage and the practice to express that in your own writing, in your own research? And how do you make sure that you are not creating research subjects, that there isn't a oppressive dynamic between you and the communities that you serve rather than research, right? Just the word research. Linda Tuhiwai-Smith in her book, Decolonizing Methodologies, she's a Maori indigenous scholar. Her second line says, research is the most dirty word in the indigenous people's vocabulary, right? How do we make sure that we have the epistemic and personal humility to decenter ourselves and serve the communities that we are hoping we amplify the knowledges of? In something that we did called Our Stories, Our Knowledges, we created a collaborative writing process with 3 sets of communities that we work with. And I'm going to put that into the chat for all of the, for everyone here so that you can look at it. And in that process, they were talking about how each of these communities decolonize knowledge and produce knowledge in their own context. So decolonization for one meant unsettling, for others, de-Brahmanizing, for a third, queering, and yet what is the resonant ways in which they do this work. So I will put that in, and I hope that it will be helpful to some of you listening. Thank you.
Well, I will second that, and I will just say that for me, it implies to try to work on achieving epistemic justice. And what does that mean, like in practical terms? As Anasuya said, it implies asking ourselves, whom are we giving voice to? What are we trying to pursue with our work or research? Are we trying to reverse that power knowledge asymmetries? Whom are we quoting? What is the literature that we are reading? Are we acknowledging other theoretical and pedagogical frameworks that are not exclusively Western? Are we balancing or trying to reverse this asymmetry between academic knowledge and embodied knowledge? Do we think that we as academics produce knowledge that is more valuable than the knowledge that is experienced by people, like in their territories? I think there are many ways that we could just incorporate that reflection in our daily work. Also, I would recommend the design justice framework. And I think for me that was very valuable, as well as the Decolonizing Methodologies book, because you have to think for what are you trying to produce knowledge? And in general, try to assume that people is the best expert in their own experience. So there is a phrase that for me is very important, and it applies for everyone who is producing knowledge, like it's basically for everybody. Nothing about us without us. So if you are working with communities, communities are the main experts of knowledge production, not you. You can just be like an ally or supporter of that knowledge production. So I would say that. Just leave it like that.
Thank you so much. That resonates with a lot of things also happening at the workshop at CSCW. People talking more and more about this kind of a shift, or maybe it's just like forgetting everything that we used to think was the right way to go. And so now there's one more question, and we might actually use 5 more minutes of your time if people want to stay for discussing this question. The question is directed to Ahmed, but I think Guido can also, if he wants to, also chime in. Would you give us an example of what you mean by privileging knowledges from everywhere within the university? Is there a model of example that exists for this kind of systemic overhaul of the university system, and acknowledging the university system stems from Western understanding of knowledge?
I mean, I would say that, Paula and Anasuya have already kind of answered this in great detail. I mean, I'm just going to recap what's already been said by others in the panel, which is knowledge production is not the sole, province of research faculty or faculty who are doing research in a university, right? We have to consider knowledge production, first of all, in several senses across the university. So giving value to an understanding that different disciplines, different ways of, I don't like using the word discipline, but different ways of producing knowledge and different ways of practicing should be given sort of like equal weight, right? Universities are very hierarchical in this way, in the way that resources are allocated, and in the way that research agendas are promoted for some and not for others, and so on and so forth. So in one way, it's knowledge across in a sort of transdisciplinary sense. But then there's also the sense that was pointed out, that students and their different experiences. Students come from especially in the kind of modern, international, cosmopolitan university, you have students from all around the world. You have students from all kinds of backgrounds, all walks of life, right? And the experience and the perspective and the knowledge that they bring, that needs to be also brought. We need to find ways of privileging that, and of privileging what students value, and what they need. And, so that's another sense. A third thing is that we need to sort of see, there's this weird thing about academia where we do research, and this is, it's kind of weird to be a humanities or a social sciences researcher talking about, say, for example, things like carcerality, when you are sitting, and the thing that enables you to do research as an academic is precisely a carceral system, right? Within which there are your colleagues and your people around you enabling you to do the work that you do that are being treated unfairly, and unequally, right? So I think that there's knowledge of that. That's a third sense within which I meant knowledge. And then there's knowledge from outside, which is, so much of scientific research, right, obscures or completely erases the people from whom that knowledge was taken. I mean, there was a project a few months ago that I was working on with a botany, a colleague of mine at NYU who's a botany professor. And so much of scientific botanical knowledge created in the 18th and 19th centuries was taken from indigenous peoples in the Americas, right? Latin American sort of botanical knowledge, without ever crediting them. And so, and Paula spoke to this, right? Where communities that we work with are the knowledge producers. We are merely informants and translators. And so credit should be given to them in knowledge production as well, instead of obscuring them or erasing them. Sorry, I go on too long, so I'll just stop here.
Would anybody like to add to that? Yes.
Not much, but I could add a little thing. Also, universities, are structures that are very old and really hard to change, and sometimes even dogmatic in many senses. So I don't know if there's an example of a university system or a university that has like very well within the system this kind of considering all knowledges. But it's hard. So going back to the point of my field now, which is entrepreneurship, entrepreneurs kind of hack the system. That's what they do. And I don't think there's a way in which you can change for once the system or improve the system. So you have to have like many hacks that will make the university system evolve toward being more open to considering all kinds of knowledge within the system. So that's my take, and I just wanted to go back to to the word, and I get the point that it might kind of cause reaction, but that's also dangerous. In Latin America, we've been using imperialism as a word to cause reaction, and after so many years, I don't see that the impact has been really large. And as an entrepreneur, I believe in hacking and building, and I think people should change because we give them more value, not just because we react. I mean, it's okay. There are problems and there's inequalities, and good entrepreneurs. What we want to make sure is that we have enough entrepreneurs and by entrepreneur I don't mean just the business kind of entrepreneur. I'm talking more in the general sense of the word, which means social entrepreneurs, civic entrepreneurs, intrapreneurs within universities and other structures that build solutions for these problems. And I think a lot of our role is to make people aware, but not in a negative way, but I mean, this is bad, what is happening in the world, we need to fix it. But we got them engaged. They have to start doing, not just talking about it. And that's my point of view in that sense. So, I mean, and if we fix universities in the sense that we're more open to knowledge, cultures, and ways of thinking on doing things, then that would be great. I mean, that would be a huge milestone toward having a more equal world. That's it. Thanks.